Hey everyone, before we start tonight's story, I just want to say that this story is written by LighthouseHorror. He is also a horror narrator here on YouTube. I will have his channel linked down in the description if you want to go check him out. He writes a lot of his own stories, and he's a phenomenal narrator, and I'm sure you guys would enjoy his channel. Anyways, let's get on to the story. I hope you guys enjoy it, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. I'm a detective, and so many years of working with the public have taught me three things. People lie, people tell half-truths, and people try to make themselves appear in the best light possible. Also, there really are things out there that can't be explained. Things you don't want to find yourself face to face with on a dark, lonely stretch of road. Lately, I find myself wanting to get it all down on paper before I forget the details. A friend of mine contacted me recently. He has decided to write a book about things he and his friends have witnessed over the years. We've agreed to post some of our stories online to see what the reaction is. I'm spending the weekend at his home, going over stories together and answering any questions he has. I can't verify the truth of any of these stories, and frankly, if you insist on disbelieving what's out there, then there is really nothing you could ever see that would persuade you otherwise. Events over the past 10 years have made me realize that I might not be around forever. There are dark things out there, unexplained things. Maybe knowing this might do some good. It might even save your life one day. Let's start at the beginning. I graduated from school with a degree in law enforcement and forensics. Fresh out of university, it was more difficult than I thought to find a job. Looking back, it's probably because I showed up to interviews with disheveled hair and slightly crumpled clothes. I'm not sure what this says about the state of our law enforcement, but a department finally did hire me, disheveled hair and all. I worked as an officer in a rural county in California. My work mostly consisted of smaller crimes like petty theft or a minor drug charge. I knew within a few months that I was going to lose my mind if I didn't change things up, so I set my mind on becoming a detective. My parents would later say they were responsible for my choice by their love of that old television show, Columbo. But I think maybe it was fate. It took me a few years, but I finally made detective. I was in my early 30s when I got the call that would alter my view of reality. It was like a fork in the road. Straight ahead was the path I'd spent my life on. One where it's true that terrible things happened, but there was always some kind of explanation. The path that veered to the left, however, was very, very different. It changes your life, seeps into your dreams, and you can't go back. A little girl, age 8, had gone missing 2 towns over. It had already been 24 hours since she had last been seen, and I was informed that the parents were currently the only suspects. I arrived to a house like any other. The family was middle class, had a nice yard with a swing set and a little playhouse. Another officer and I checked every inch of the property surrounding the house for footprints and signs of entry. Though some hours had gone by since her disappearance, the heavy rain had made the ground soft. It was impossible to conceal footprints if someone had gotten near the home. We checked every inch of the house, the garage, and the shed, finding nothing. I was greeted at the front steps by the father who nodded. "Please come in," he said somberly. We sat down in the living area, and I began to ask them questions. The basics. How long had she been gone? Where was she last seen? Had they seen anything out of the ordinary the past few days? After a while, I could tell they had nothing to do with it. They were terrified. The mother could barely even speak. She just sat there, staring down at the glass table in front of her, hands shaking. I looked at them both one last time, checking to see if I had missed any signs of guilt, but nothing. I was sure they were innocent. "May I look in your daughter's room? It might help us find some indication of where she may have gone." Nodding without even looking up, the two of them just sat together, despondent and broken. I can tell you that most of the time I have dealt with cases of missing loved ones. Within the first few days, the parents and family typically are very worried but hopeful for their return. This was an especially odd case for me, due to their withdrawn demeanor and the unspoken thought between them that their daughter was indeed gone and was not coming back. I found the wooden staircase in the back of their home, leading up to their daughter's room. The quiet sound of rain had begun to patter off the trees and windows. I remember it was raining because, as I climbed the steps, I was suddenly reminded of one of my favorite paintings. It hung over the mantel in my parents' home. Family standing in a field, holding hands and staring right out of the frame, almost back at you. Rain pours down behind them, and you can tell that in a few moments, the storm will be on them as well. There's no outrunning it. That thought went through my head as I climbed the staircase and made my way down the hallway. The house was larger than expected, but I knew which room was the little girl's by the pattern of stars spelling out her name on the outside of the door. Pushing the door open with a creak, a warm purple light greeted me from near the window. For a young girl, she was very organized. Everything in her room had its place. No clothes were unfolded, and every paper on her desk was neatly placed. I spent a few minutes going through them but found nothing out of the ordinary. Just homework assignments and a few math sheets she must have been using to study. I checked under her bed, in her closet, and even under her mattress when I noticed something I hadn't seen at first. The old wooden desk had a drawer sticking out of the right side of near the window. Sitting down at her desk, I opened the drawer, found a small notebook, perfectly placed in the single drawer. Pulled it out, lit a cigarette, and opened the journal. The first few drawings were nothing out of the ordinary. Her home, her family. On one she had drawn a puppy in a field of flowers. Typical little girl stuff. This little girl was very organized. Every person was neatly labeled below. Mommy, Daddy, me, etc. It wasn't until I went to put the book away that I almost missed a folded page in the very back of the book. I opened the paper and drew her lamp closer to get a better look. There were pink walls speckled with stars and planets, a desk in the drawer by the window, and a child asleep in her bed. Sure enough, underneath the child was written the word, me. I paused, took a breath and looked closer at the window in her drawing. Though it was scribbled over, I could still see the faint outline of something looking through. Below were 3 words, written over and over again. It's not real. We never found her. The second incident happened a few months later in the winter of the same year. I'd gotten a call in the late afternoon about a sailboat grounded near Muscle Rock Park. I asked the gentleman on the phone why they called me instead of the Coast Guard. His response was to the point. There were 3 bodies, and certain things were questionable. I hung up the phone, shrugged, and drove out to the ocean where the boats had been found. The park was beautiful. Waves crashed upon boulders while seagulls flew from rock to rock, dodging the waves. The sailboat had somehow wedged itself into a set of rocks, and so far the authorities had been unable to pull it ashore. They were also worried that moving it might interfere with the evidence and had been waiting for me to arrive. The boat appears peaceful, about 30 yards offshore and swaying gently side to side. Climbing onto the dinghy, an old Coast Guard officer motored me over to the boat and tied us on. He nodded at me as I stepped onto the boat and was greeted by 2 men on the deck. I never asked them, but they must have been Coast Guard as well. They're down below, one of the men said. I nodded, not sure what I was going to find, but completely unprepared for what I did. Walking below, I saw a table set for dinner, a man on one side, a woman, and a boy around age 12 on the other. Their bodies were rigid and firm, looking frozen in place. I wondered how their bodies still managed to remain upright after the crash. Everything in the boat was stowed neatly away, and there were no signs of struggle, no obvious cause of death as well. Their expressions were blank. Not surprised or afraid, just blank. I took countless photographs of everything, knowing this wasn't a typical case. As I bent over to take one of the boy, I noticed the tag sticking out on the front of his shirt. It was inside out and backwards. That's strange, I thought. Then I looked at the woman. Her clothing seemed normal, but both of her shoes were on the wrong feet. Without a clue as to what had happened, I was forced to wait for the coroner's report. A few days later, I found it on my desk. Reading it, I was in complete disbelief. After the autopsy, the father, mother, and child were all found missing something. The boy was missing his liver, the mother her right lung, and the father was missing his heart. After reading the report, I took lunch early and went to talk to the coroner in person a few cities away. He looked shaken and looked me straight in the eye. This just isn't possible. he said. There wasn't a mark anywhere on the bodies. No incisions. Nothing. This just isn't possible. Turns out, the family was on a 2-week vacation. They were planning on sailing out to the Farallon Islands off the coast of San Francisco. 6 days out, they were reported missing by the grandfather after failing to contact him at the pre-planned time. No further evidence was ever found. The case remains open to this day. The last story has to do with a call that a friend of mine was on. I got a call at 2 a.m. saying that another officer named Henry had just suffered a heart attack and was currently being taken to the local hospital. The captain knew how close the two of us were, and I was the second one after Henry's brother that they thought to call. The drive to the hospital took me about 3 hours, and when I finally got there, I was more than relieved to see Henry sitting upright in his bed, talking, albeit weakly and slowly. I remember the look on his face. Fear. If you knew Henry, you would understand how out of the ordinary this was. He was not a fearful man. 2 combat tours in the military, and working with me on some of the most disturbing cases you could imagine, and I'd never seen him scared. Not once. He was about 20 years older than I, and was the one I had always looked to in situations where I couldn't find an answer. He always came through. This is what he told me. I got the call right as I was leaving after a long day. I was about to clock out for the day when Sally happened to come across me in the hall. Smiling, she told me a call had just come in about a disturbance at a local school. A neighboring home had said there was loud, constant noise coming from the playground of the school. They had specifically mentioned near the swings. I gave Sally a certain type of look, told her I hadn't worked at the department for over 20 years to be going out at 8 at night to deal with a couple of loud 16-year-olds on a swing set. She gave me that smile she always does, and I headed out on the call. I arrived at the school at around 8:30, give or take, and I remember having to drive up a hill surrounded by trees on both sides. When I got to the school, I was not happy. Obviously there was noise because there were maybe 100 children but no teachers in sight. There was music playing, and it seemed to be some type of festival or school celebration or something. I radioed over to Sally that when I got back, her and I were going to have a conversation. Then I exited the car and walked over to the playground. I walked through a group of children, standing there listening to the music, and what appeared to be a tall man on a wooden stage directly in front of the swings. I didn't want to disturb the activities, but I sure as hell wasn't going out this way again tonight. So I made my way to the only adult I could find. I noticed there was a banner attached to the stage, which read, Harvest Day, in old-style lettering. It didn't strike me as anything out of the ordinary. What happened next, John? I don't understand. I got to the front of the stage and waved down the tall gentleman speaking. At first, he didn't notice me. Then I spoke louder. This time, he noticed. His head turned rapidly toward me. He looked momentarily surprised. Then a wide smile crept over his face. Welcome, friend, he said. Not everyone can see what is before them. As his gaze met mine, I could see his eyes clearly. They were solid black. I remember feeling my chest tense up, and the last thing I can tell you is that before I passed out, I turned around to see the faces of the children. Their bodies were not like they had been before. They looked almost like ash. Their skin was charred and burnt, and the smell was something else. Their eyes were gone, but they stared at me nonetheless. The pressure in my chest became unbearable, and I can't be sure, but I think that I was passing out. The man said one last thing. I'll see you soon, Henry. Henry was found hours later, near death in an abandoned parking lot where an old school had been. Sally had known something wasn't right when he hadn't called back in, and sent a car to check it out. He'd had a heart attack. His first. Luckily, it was somewhat mild, and he had survived. I hope you enjoyed these accounts. There are more to come. Thank you again for your interest and feedback for part 1 of the stories. It's been a pleasure going through the comments together, and I hope you enjoy this next edition. On the first Friday of each month, I would get a visit from the old detective. I'd sit on the dock and wait to hear any sign of my friend coming so I could start my journey across the marina. You could hear the old, broken down 2-seater coming from 3 counties over, making it across the dock and up the ramp to the parking lot. I smiled at Henry and grabbed a handful of fishing gear. We set up near my boat in a virtually empty section of the marina. Noticing approaching storm clouds, we opted to have a beer and fish from the dock while we waited for the storm to pass. That way, we could take cover in case the sky opened up and really started to pour. "How's the ticker?" I asked. "Tick-tock, John," he answered back, winking in my direction. We hadn't spoken any more about what he had told me at the hospital, but I think there was an understanding between us. At that time in my career, had it been anyone else that had told me the story, I would have chalked it up to a hallucination brought on by a heart attack. That evening, after not catching a thing all day, we packed up his gear and sat back down to relax and have a cup of coffee. Henry looked tired, and I hoped the coffee would keep him awake for his drive home. We had talked around the subject all day, and I was more than fine with not discussing it further, when suddenly, Henry looked me in the eye. "I know what you're thinking," he said. "Henry, you don't have to. You're thinking it was a lack of oxygen in my brain. You're thinking it was just a hallucination. Generally speaking, I might have thought that too, but the thing is, I think something's following me. Not all the time, but once in a while, and only when I'm alone. I see something move out of the corner of my eye, usually in the distance, but sometimes it's close." I try to think of something encouraging to say. "Well, at least you've finally got some company," I said with a smirk. He laughed as we turned back to the water, watching as the last of the sunlight started to fade into darkness. "Why don't you stay with me for a few days? Fishing and being around a friend might do you some good," I said. "I'll be fine," Henry replied, "but thank you." After walking him up to the parking lot, I stood there watching his taillights grow smaller and then fade completely from sight. I was worried about him. Later that night, I found it difficult to sleep and walked down the empty dock. Standing at the edge of the pier, I looked over at the low wall surrounding the marina. Beyond the wall is the shipping lane, and I watched as a freighter made its slow passage across the horizon. The decks of the ship were empty, and I thought how peaceful a life on the ocean could be. All of your problems a million miles away, just you and the ocean. I'd always wanted to cross the ocean at night, surrounded by nothing but stars. I was about to turn and go back inside, when I had a strange feeling like someone was watching me. Turning back towards the massive freighter, I took a look closer. Squinting, I could just make out someone standing on the upper deck. He appeared to be looking right at me. It was hard to tell from this distance, but the figure seemed to be unusually tall, and something about this made me very uneasy. I looked down for a moment. When I looked back at the ship, there was nothing there. The next case involved the body of a woman washing up on shore. A few weeks had passed since I last saw Henry. After his heart attack and subsequent story, the captain had been reluctant to send him out into the field again. He did finally allow him to work the scene, and we were assigned as partners on the case. I never told Henry, but the captain asked me personally to keep an eye on him. I would wager that in most departments, if a man had just had a heart attack and a hallucination, they wouldn't allow him back to work so soon, or maybe ever again. But that's just a testament to how good of a detective Henry was. We drove together over the Golden Gate Bridge and headed north past more woods in the old coastal highway. Arriving at our destination, we were met by a young officer, a woman, maybe in her late 20s. She walked us over, through the web of caution tape that encircled the scene. Handing me his camera, Henry knelt down to get a closer look at the deceased woman, while I photographed the surrounding area. Right from the beginning, I could tell this was going to be a strange one. The deceased woman looked to be well over 100 years old, although her skin was perfectly intact. It was creased and deeply wrinkled with age. Her hair was completely white, and her body was withered and hunched. She was wearing a pale pink dress with tiny seahorses and starfish embroidered along the neckline, and she had a silver necklace on. The necklace, upon further examination, had a pendant hanging from it, 3 small silver circles twisted together to form some kind of misshapen triangle. It still looked pristine. I noted as I took a photograph. No scratches or imperfections. No sign of seaweed or algae on the necklace at all. I looked back down at the woman's body and noted there was no seaweed or algae on her clothing as well. Different thoughts went through my mind. This isn't right. I told Henry. No, it's not, he replied softly. From the start, something was very off. We bounced crazy theories back and forth, but for 3 days, we made little to no progress on the case. She had no identification on her, and had not been reported missing. For the moment, there was no way to move forward. All we could do was wait. Local news covered the death as an unidentified woman, and we waited for her family or friends to claim her, but no one did. Not a single call in 3 days. One of our theories involved the old woman having dementia and wandering into the ocean, but still you would think that someone would report her missing. We called all the surrounding nursing home facilities, but again, found nothing. Now what happened next was an accident, really. I was working at my desk on another case and had no desire to answer unrelated phone calls from the reception desk. Sally had other plans, though. She had caught a bad case of the flu and would be out for the next couple days. With no one watching the front desk, we took turns fielding incoming calls. It was Carl Mitchell's turn, but he was nowhere to be found, so I picked up the receiver. A young man was on the other end.
Hello? Is this the police?
He asked. This is the police, I answered calmly.
My fiancée has gone missing. I mean, I don't know if she's missing, but I can't find her anywhere. We were supposed to meet for breakfast yesterday morning.
Okay. When was the last time you saw her? I asked.
A week ago. We normally see each other every day, but I was out of town for work. I tried calling her, but we had gotten into an argument before I left, and I figured she just wanted some space.
He replied. I asked the young man his fiance's name, age, home address, and various other questions. Her name was Mary. She was 22 years old, and had dark brown hair and green eyes. I was about to hang up when I asked him one final question. I don't know why I asked this, because in retrospect, it was irrelevant. He hadn't seen her in a week's time, but I asked anyway. Do you remember what she was wearing when you last saw her? He thought for a moment and then replied,
Yeah, I do actually. She was wearing jeans and a gray sweatshirt.
He said, pausing.
And a necklace?
Momentarily hesitating, I asked, Can you describe the necklace?
I can. It was circles. I mean, it had 3 circles on it.
He replied. After hanging up the phone, I called Henry over and told him about the call. I wonder if they got it from the same place, he said. We both wondered about the coincidence. As the young man had headed to the station, I retrieved the necklace from the evidence room. Perhaps both disappearances could be linked to this item. When the young man arrived, I pulled the necklace out from the evidence bag and set it on the table before him. I instantly realized the mistake I had made. Oh my God, is she okay? He stammered. Where did you find that? No, this isn't hers. The current case I'm on involves someone with a similar item. It's not her. Don't worry. We are still looking for your fiancé. Once he calmed down, the young man confirmed that his fiancé's necklace was indeed the same as the old woman's. I asked him if he knew where she had purchased the necklace, but all he knew was that a few weeks ago, Mary had been overjoyed, telling him how she had found the most beautiful necklace at an old antique shop in the city. We shook hands, and I told him we were doing everything we could to find Mary. That night, Henry and I headed over to take a look around Mary's apartment. Maybe we could find another link between her and the old woman. We spent a couple hours checking her apartment for anything that might help us. In every case, there's always one key piece of information that breaks it. We found nothing out of the ordinary. She seemed very stable, very organized. She was studying to become a lawyer. I was getting ready to head out when I found Henry in Mary's room, sitting on her bed. He held an album of photographs on his lap, and he had paused on a single page. Henry looked up at me without emotion, then back down at the photo. Sitting down next to him, I took a deep breath. The picture showed Mary and her fiancé sitting together on a park bench in what looked like San Francisco. They had asked a friend or passerby to take the photo. Though not yet wearing the necklace, Mary was wearing a pale pink dress with what looked like little starfish and seahorses embroidered along the collar. We never exactly solved that case, but we had our theories. Still do.